Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Jessica Pishko. She is the author of the great book, The Highest Law in the Land. Welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me, David.
I finally got to read your book in April, which was interesting because, first of all, we've known each other for quite a while, and I knew you as you were writing this book, so it was already on my list to read. I just didn't get to it quite when it came out, but um, it's interesting because in a lot of ways it's a criminal justice book, but it kind of bleeds into all of this federal government uh, stuff that is currently in the news. And so reading it in April, it's like, oh, wow, yeah, this is really a relevant book to now. But let's back up a little bit and talk about kind of your passion for sheriffs and why this is really an underexplored topic within these circles.
My passion for sheriffs, I guess I would say my passion for not having sheriffs. But I think, I mean, realistically, most people who are in the criminal justice world or who work at law schools or who are attorneys and public defenders, quite frankly, they live in cities. And I do think that this is just a fact that has a lot to do with why sheriffs and rural criminal justice systems are understudied generally. That, for people in Los Angeles or Chicago or New York or DC, sheriffs don't feel extremely relevant to them. Maybe an exception, I would say an exception perhaps in Los Angeles, but sheriffs don't feel extremely relevant. They aren't as active in people's lives. I mean, and to be fair and honest, like most people live in urban areas, right? Like the population of the United States is concentrated in certain urban areas. That is where the people who are writing books and law reviews and all these things are. So I just think like it's physically not as present. I also think that one of the things that I realized when I started the project, to be quite frank, was that a lot of people were not particularly, not that they weren't interested, but I was constantly being dissuaded from pursuing it as a topic of study because a lot of people either thought that one, it wasn't a terribly relevant lever to pull. They didn't, some people who do criminal justice work didn't think that sheriffs would be a good lever to pull if you were interested in reform or decarceration, was the big response I got. And that two, that a lot of these sheriffs who are active in right-wing sheriff movements and politics, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about later, that they are primarily in more rural areas and that they really didn't have a big impact on the criminal legal system or politics overall.
So why is that view wrong?
Well, I think it's wrong for a few reasons. I think, first of all, I would say, like, here and now I will advocate openly, like, I think rural criminal justice systems are extremely important to study. One thing that we do know is that the punishment the punishment the criminal system metes out is simply uneven. And if you look at a lot of rural areas or suburban areas, people are getting disproportionately long sentences for many things that in a place like New York or San Francisco, quite frankly, they would probably not even be arrested. And that's just a fact, right? Like if you cross a county line, you will get a much harsher sentence, right? And you will get a huge bail. I mean, just as a small thing, like bail amounts alone in rural areas, we are talking $20,000 bail for something that's drug possession. Huge amounts of bail for things that, like I said, in cities, they probably might not even arrest you or you might get a citation. And then we also know that the data on violence, police violence, is very much skewed. So right now, I think people listening to this probably know that police violence has not gone down, right? It's gone up since 2020, but a great deal of that increase is actually in rural and suburban areas. So we do have, in fact, like this kind of epidemic of police violence that's happening in places that aren't urban. Again, to circle back to like it's understudied, there's less scrutiny, the punishments are harsher. And then I think in terms of politics, what I saw was that when Trump was running in 2020, that there were a lot of that there was a great deal of support by sheriffs behind him, and that I did not think that this feeling would necessarily go away, right? And as he started to campaign in 2024, he said, and we now see, right, that a great deal of his platform was this promise to, I think sometimes he framed it as like unleash the police, to not just do mass deportations, but to like eliminate oversight, kind of eliminate what few rules there were that was sort of restricting police violence. And that on the ground, a lot of people who were officers and who were sheriffs were really supportive of it. And while I see like it is a fair argument to say like some of the most extreme right-wing sheriffs are in more rural areas, this is true. But what they were saying was something I started to hear repeated over and over in bigger and bigger organizations, like and more mainstream organizations, sort of not just like what you might call like fringe extremist organizations. And so I felt very strongly that like this was a growing movement that would probably not go away. And unfortunately, right now, here we are.
So we'll get into that in a minute, but one point that you made that kind of resonates with me is kind of this urban rural divide because there was an interesting poll. It came out sometime last fall before the election, but it kind of showed that people that were incarcerated were pretty evenly split in terms of supporting Trump versus not supporting Trump. And I think that surprised a lot of people. But, people like me who talk with people that are incarcerated all the time know that, even though there's kind of this spread out phenomenon in rural America actually has a pretty high crime rate. You don't think about it like you do when you go into an inner city because everything's really concentrated in the inner city. But you drive through the back roads of America and you see these dilapidated homes and you see this very stark poverty, maybe even worse poverty than you see in the cities. And these are all rural folks, and these are all folks that are, enforced by sheriffs, and they vote for Trump. And some of them have some interesting cognitive dissonance on some of these issues of law enforcement because on the one hand they kind of support law enforcement, but on the other hand they're on the receiving end of law enforcement. And so this is kind of a I think is kind of the future of the debate over criminal justice is going to be this urban rural divide.
Yes, I mean, I tend to agree. So it is very interesting. So I now live in North Carolina. So I sometimes use like Appalachia as an example, right, of like extreme over incarceration. And so it is true that the kinds of, crimes, the things people are being arrested for are different, right? So we have different sorts of things. So for example, in a lot of rural areas, domestic violence is like the most common violent crime, right? Most homicides are going to be related to domestic violence. A lot of crimes are a result of like drug use or sort of, as you point out, like lack of services. So like you have a lot of people who are incarcerated for meth use and selling or opioid use and selling, right? So this sort of problem of kind of economic abandonment plus like I think honestly a sort of hollowing out of like services and hospitals and other things has led to high incarceration. And if you look at incarceration rates, like some of the highest incarceration rates per capita. Particularly, it's very stark actually if you look at women. The states where women are the most incarcerated are states like Oklahoma, Idaho, and Kentucky. And what these states all have in common, quite frankly, is a lot of white poor people, right? And I want to say up front, when you look at the racial disparities in the criminal legal system, like it is far and away true that Black people experience all the things more, right? Incarceration more, longer times, right? They're disproportionately incarcerated. But the second thing, the second kind of factor is poverty. And so when you're talking about, the quote unquote white working class, or sort of, white poor, like that is a group of people that are disproportionately incarcerated. They have criminal records. They are, rather likely to not have like their driver's license or things like that. So like you are talking about this group of people who experience also police violence, right? So and I will say it's very stark when you look at women. Like right now, the fastest growing group of incarcerated people is actually white women, white poor women, which again is a smaller in number, but is I think something to think about. But even when you look at groups like a lot of militia style groups, like the Oath Keepers, and three percenters, I mean, to be honest, like their ideology is not necessarily pro police. This, of course, during January 6th, this sort of came as a surprise to some people because they associate, I think, right wing militias with Back the Blue and kind of like, oh, like all working class or rural white people support the police. And for me, it was, I think, less surprising because I had, long been talking to people in this sort of space of like, well, we support the idea of using mm, we support the idea of using some kind of state violence in order to like preserve a particular hierarchy is how I would say and frame it, but that did not necessarily translate into like support for all police. And so they were able to pull apart, I think, their support for what we would call looks like policing, like kind of enforcing hierarchies through violence, um, but not necessarily like supporting the police.
So I want to kind of get into your book a little bit. And one of the interesting aspects, and you kind of allude to it at various points in time, is you're like interacting with these people. And like, what was that like for you? And how did they kind of respond to you?
I think that, well, I would say there's a few different responses. For a lot of the sheriffs, particularly right-wing sheriffs, to be perfect, and a lot of the right wing in general, what they're doing is rather open and public, right? I mean, they have podcasts and whatever. They have like a variety of sort of video networks, right? And social media networks. So they're not particularly concerned or embarrassed about what they're doing, right? They're actually rather happy to talk about their views and to talk about what they're doing to someone who sort of appears to be interested. And I will say, like, I am often asked this question about like my own like personal safety and stuff like that. And I will say, like, I am a white woman, middle aged. Like, quite frankly, people did not pay a whole lot of attention to me. I don't know that I necessarily drew like a great deal of attention. I didn't try to draw a lot of attention to myself either, but I don't know that people saw me as either extremely threatening, like, had I been like a man of color, I think they would have seen me different. But also I was like sincerely interested in what they had to say. I think it also helps that I grew up in Texas. I'm not, from like an urban area, so I could sort of say, with some with some credibility that like, oh, I was from Texas, which is something people like to talk about. Um, so, and a lot of the people who like these sheriffs similarly, like they're actually kind of like their views are not secret. And I sometimes say talk sometimes when I think about journalism and media, like if there's a fault, it's sort of like failing to see the thing that people are just saying out loud. Like they're just saying this thing out loud. And while it might seem strange, and I'll be honest, like the hardest part of reporting was probably two things. One, it's sort of like people are speaking a different language. as if like the stories they would tell me were not things I had ever heard. Like someone was talking about that they didn't like the way they taught math and that they didn't like Joe Biden because math was being taught different. And I was like, I have no idea what this person is talking about. And I realized that they were like getting their news from different sources, right? That they were just getting their news from a place I didn't get my news from. And I had not heard this story. And I think the other thing was like, because of this kind of internet culture and like meme culture, like a lot of what you say and do gets used against you. So like the right is very happy to take your work or take your product and kind of like regurgitate it for their own purposes. So as time went on, if I published stories, stories I wrote would get republished in like right-wing media and sort of used as like a commentary on like, oh, this sheriff is very, punitive. Oh, well, that's great. Like we really like that, so they sort of like regurgitate what I said. And I mean, I guess the best at some point in time, like one of the things I try to do, as a journalist was like, as much as I think a lot of sheriffs themselves did not like me personally, or at least they knew what I was doing, right? At a certain point, they knew what my project was and what I was doing. They would sometimes say, like, well, you write down what I say accurately. Like you're accurate, like that is what I said. And I said, well, yes, I do write down what I do indeed write down what you say accurately. Like my effort is to be accurate. Of course, I may not agree on how I view what you said, but like I am doing it accurately.
Um, and ultimately, you come to the conclusion that the sheriff's office should not exist at all. Now, did this evolve, or did you come into this project with that view and this kind of cement it?
So honestly, it was something that came as I reported the project. And my background has long been in like criminal system reform. So I had worked on projects that involved, electing progressive minded prosecutors and like looking at, different ways to reduce incarceration and reduce the reliance on cash bail. And so I had always been very invested in like a lot of these projects that, we might call like reform style projects, right? And that was very much my background and things I reported on. What happened as I worked on the book, to be honest, was that by the time I put together current reporting with history, it was simply very hard for me to argue that some of this was justified, right? That a lot of the patterns we see. So, one of the things I point out is just that every sort of change or reform that's intended to make the system better. For example, maybe electing a sheriff who says that they will be like less punitive and more helpful to immigrant communities or communities of color, that each one of these changes is really met with a backlash that is, approximately 50 times the ask of the reform. And a lot of these views came to me after 2020, right? When I realized that even though this was like a pandemic and people were like sincerely trying to decarcerate jails, that these sheriffs did not want to do it and they would not do it willingly, even though many of them would say that they understood the problem and they understood the danger and the concern. They would nevertheless say something to the effect of, well, I can't do it because other sheriffs will get upset. And so then I realized that what was actually going on was a sort of like, circular problem, like a fraternity problem, that they did not want to do things that would sort of upset like the way things had been done. When I started to look at efforts at reform and change through that lens, right, that was exactly what I saw, was that every time a sort of change had come or a reform would be proposed, that the system itself would sort of reform to both like swallow that change. I mean, body cams are a good one to look at, right? That the whole policing would just simply accept body cams, but then completely reform like many things they were doing to make body cams no longer as useful as like a tool of accountability.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So one question I guess I have is, as you were getting into this, like, Were you viewing this as, kind of an extension of the discussion of criminal justice reform and the need for reform versus abolition? Or were you really expecting this thing to be so tied up in the far right movement?
When I began, this is another aspect that evolved. So I came to it as like a criminal system reform person. So I
Right.
actually like originally was like, this is a criminal reform book. Of course, what happened, right? So let's say I started the book around 2020. And of course, 2021 was January 6th, right? And then we started to see all of the backlash to the protests of 2020, right? This sort of anti-violence protests of 2020, plus the reactions to COVID mitigation measures. And it was just hard to ignore the far right aspect of it. It was impossible to ignore the role of constitutional sheriff movements and other kind of right-wing movements. And actually, I mean, and what I wanted to do in the book was to bring the two together. I think frequently people talk about them differently. Sometimes people talk about right-wing violence as a sort of basically a criminal problem, like a problem for the FBI, a problem to prosecute. We prosecute people on the far right. We prosecute the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, right? This is what we prosecute the Klan. This is what we do, right? We prosecute. But of course, I was looking at a book about criminal system reform, and I was like, well, what do you do? Like, this is not feeling like a viable strategy when the people involved in this movement are the law enforcement. And the sort of simple answer of like, oh, well, we just prosecute the bad sheriffs and keep the good sheriffs, right, was another aspect that to me really started to break down. And a lot of this was because if you look at outcomes, unfortunately, there are not actually big differences in criminal justice outcomes between right-wing sheriffs and non-right-wing sheriffs, like in terms of jail deaths or violence or any of the metrics you might use. There's actually not huge differences, for a variety of reasons, I think. But like, it was, I was like, oh, well, no one's really tried to like square this circle. No one's tried to say, like, why do we keep looking at right-wing violence as a problem for the FBI? Now, of course, the FBI, right now, of course, the problem is the FBI is that, right? We sort of now, I mean, now it seems more useful, or I felt like I saw that coming because now I said, oh, well, these people are the right wing. And so we cannot use federal prosecution as a strategy to like reduce the violence of the right wing. Like that's not an option anymore. So we have to like come up with other ideas.
Yeah, that was one thing I was going to ask you about because, what I've noticed is if you have political discussions or policy discussions with any law enforcement, what you're generally going to end up with is somebody who is frankly scary, right? Like their politics are scary, and then you're like, okay, and this guy's got a gun and he can lock people up, and that's even scarier. Like this has been going on for a long time. So what makes sheriffs different though than just run-of-the-mill law enforcement scary right wingers?
I mean, I do want to say that I think that that is a fair, like, people have been talking and writing about the, I guess, violent and antisocial attitudes of like people in law enforcement for a while. So, like, when I talk about sheriffs, I by no mean I'm trying to say, like, oh, well, sheriffs are one way and like police are different. And I think now we even see, like, I think great gaps between police chiefs and their rank and file, right? Like I would say
Yeah.
there's a big difference in the politics of like a police chief and their rank and file, and that's become really obvious, right? That's like a huge gap right now. And I think that some of this, quite frankly, had just got worse. Like the what I would call the sort of right wing movement of sheriffs has just like infected more and more people. I mean, the interesting thing about sheriffs is that they're the example of like right wing populism, right? Sheriffs are elected, and so they have a form of democratic legitimacy. I mean, right now we hear a lot of people saying the word like they have an electoral mandate, which is something sheriffs have been saying forever, that they are elected and therefore they have a mandate from the people of their community to do the things that they said they would do, right? And so I think because their role feels rooted in like democratic legitimacy, unlike other police, right? Unlike other police that are administrative agencies with appointed people and, they do variety of things that sheriffs feel like they were elected to do a job. They are sort of on par with other elected officials in your county, right? So they, like your district attorney, like your county commissioners, they sort of all sit like side by side. And so because the sheriff sees themselves as legitimate for a reason, they are elected, and that their choices and policies are not just like personal preference, but are sort of like a mandate, and that sheriffs are, I think, as many people properly point out, like more conservative as a whole, that kind of than other either like local politicians. Very common to have like your sheriff will be more conservative than your county commissioners, for example, is like a really common issue. And that has always given the role like this sense of like entitlement that bleeds through, right? It is like the sense that sheriffs are hard to check, which is true, right? That sheriffs are hard to oversee because they are elected, is part because they are elected and they are kind of co-equals with other parts of county government, but also because they use that to their advantage to say, well, you can't tell me what to do. And not necessarily that it's legally impossible, right? They're sort of, can you legally do things? Well, sure, states pass laws to tell people to do things all the time. Like that's just the way the law works. But people are afraid they like take that democratic legitimacy seriously. And so they think, well, if I tell the sheriff you can't do XYZ, that is maybe undermining democratic legitimacy, and I am worried. And I think it's the same feeling that we see now, right? With Trump will say, I have democratic legitimacy, like this is my mandate. And many Democrat people in the House and the Senate say, well, he has a point. He was democratically elected. Like, I don't know. Are we, maybe that's part of the paralysis of Congress, right? To say like, well, I don't know. They were Democrat. I'm confused. They were democratically elected. So what am I supposed to do about that, right? And that had always like puzzled me for a while because we tend to think like more democracy is good. And so I had also spending a lot of time thinking about like, how do we think about when democracy isn't good? How do we even talk about that?
Well, that's a topic for another show. But I do want to get into this concept of constitutional sheriffs because your book really centers around this movement. And what is that?
So the constitutional sheriff movement is a right-wing movement. And I want to say it's called the constitutional sheriff movement, not because it's in the Constitution or has nothing to do with like laws. I call it a legal-ish. I started like adopting for like legal-ish movement. Like it's got the patina of a law word, and constitution is a positive word. So people are like, we like the Constitution. So their idea is basically that sheriffs are responsible for enforcing the Constitution, by which they mean what they would call like the original Constitution, which is the first 10 amendments. And it's a
And
specifically
really the Second Amendment.
mostly a lot of the second. There's a lot of Second Amendment and no like 14th, like let's like, and First Amendment. It is really honestly just a sort of sheriff version of originalism. Like it's backwards looking. It's looking backwards to say, oh, what, with a mythological idea of like, oh, what did founding fathers or what did Patrick Henry mean when he talked about the militia? How do we look at, the Constitution? How can we bring back these ideas of the original Constitution? And so as a movement, right, I call it a right-wing movement because it is like very clearly reaction to movements like it's hard to call the Civil War a movement, but movements towards like movements towards racial equality, like all it's opposed to racial equality, it's opposed to gender equality, it's opposed to LGBTQ equality, right? It's like, so it has that like backward, xenophobia has that like backwards looking momentum. In a sense, though, it is also like the roots of it are also deeply libertarian. It has a sort of sense of like skepticism towards the federal government, dislike of, quote, federal overreach, which is usually taxes, gun control, a lot of like deep respect for private property. These are the libertarian qualities, like I think in these right-wing movements are right now like less evident, but like there is this sort of string of like searches and seizures, right? Like the ATF shouldn't be able to come to your house and take your guns. That's an unreasonable search and seizure. Your property is your own. So like if you don't want to build a wheelchair ramp at your establishment, that's your right. That's a private property right. So right, it's sort of it has that vibe to it as well.
So how does this tie into Trumpism?
So I think that what I saw, so a lot of these constitutional sheriff movement has it, they have its roots in basically segregationist states' rights, segregation, and from there, right, it moves forward and kind of adopts some libertarian principles along the way. Now, what Trump is doing is a little different, and I have been thinking a lot about like how do we think about what Trump is doing to the federal government in light of right-wing movements in general that oppose federal overreach, right? And so I think it is like useful to think about. That's why I argue that the constitutional sheriff movement is specifically a right-wing movement and not an anti-government movement. And this is something that sometimes you will hear it called, it's an anti-government movement, when especially when they refer to things like the Ruby Ridge standoff or the Bundy standoff, right? These sort of infamous like Western standoffs with the federal government. Um, but I sort of argue in the book, like at root, the proper way to see it is just like right wing politics, as I said, like opposition to kind of what we would call now like DEI, opposition to DEI, opposition to like forms of equality, opposition to like family structures that are not, a mother and a father. Constitutional sheriffs also oppose, for example, reproductive justice, right? They, despite personal property rights, they don't think, And I think the most important thing about constitutional sheriffs, though, that links it to Trumpism is this idea that the Constitution is sort of, it's not like a document people can like revise and think about. It's like a holy document. Like the Trump Bible, if people know that there was a Trump Bible, the Trump Bible has the Constitution in it. Like it's like the Bible with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the back. Because, right, like that's how they see the Constitution. It is basically like the Bible. It is God given, and that the ideas that they represent. So, for example, Second Amendment rights, let's say gun ownership, it's not just that, oh, well, in this country, we have more gun protections than other countries. It's no, in this country, sort of there is a religious, like, holy mandate to have guns. And if you take it away, you are violating like a sacred gift that comes from above, right? It's not like Thomas Jefferson wrote it or whatever. It's like it comes from this sort of religious basis. And this is actually where I think Trumpism gets a lot of its like power, is because it's not just, oh, this is a good idea because this seems like a good way to run the government. It's no, this is not just like a democratic mandate or an electoral mandate. It's a holy mandate. And to violate it is like violating someone's deeply held belief, which is the part that one of the things that I was really interested in, right? Because you cannot just tell someone that their deeply held belief is wrong. It's a deeply held belief. They are going to fight. I mean, right? They will
Yep.
pick up a gun and fight
They
for it.
will use alternative facts to fight you.
Right. I mean, and they will use, and they will use violence, right? All didn't Trump's post like say something on Twitter like he who saves his country violates no law. If you are fighting a holy war, you are not violating the law. And that is something constitutional sheriffs like very much agree with, right? That it doesn't matter if you're violating a law, so long as you are upholding kind of your sacred obligation.
So we're almost out of time, but I want to kind of introduce a couple of the characters that you discuss in great detail in your book because they're very fascinating figures.
Sure. I guess we can start with Mr. Richard Mack,
Yeah.
who still goes by sheriff. So sheriffs, I learned, go by sheriff even when they haven't been sheriff in decades. Um, so Richard Mack is an ex-Arizona sheriff. He was sheriff in the sort of 80s. I think he ended around 1992. So he actually eventually lost his election because he was spending too much time doing politics. But he kind of took it upon himself. He was recruited by the NRA to be a lead plaintiff in one of the early gun rights cases. It's a case called Prince, which was named after a different sheriff in Montana. And what Mac had the idea to do was he kind of united his sort of spiritual conspiracy laden ideas. He came from this kind of right wing string of Mormon thought that is like very conspiracy driven. And he wanted to unite that with kind of the militia idea of like Second Amendment supremacy and how can we make this country, in a way, how can we make this country great again? So he came up with the idea of kind of the constitutional sheriff movement, almost by a bit of a fluke. And I think the easiest way to think of Richard Mack is alongside someone like Stuart Rhodes, who they really kind of brought each other up or brought each other down, depending on how you think about it. But they kind of like, were able to unite these interests together.
So are these guys really like flamboyant or, are they like good old boys or how would you describe them?
Richard Mack is very much like a buttoned up preacher.
Hmm.
So he actually, his background, I think he was in like theater as a teen, like he sang in musicals and stuff. And so he has, I think, a very like passionate reverence for what he says. But he is also like, one of the things about him is he is older and he does not have the kind of like edge lord, like meme driven stuff about him that like what I would call like the newer iteration of the right has. Like he does not have that about him. He has sort of like old school old school right wing, which means like he maintains a very like upright demeanor. So I mean, as an example, he would not like yell at me or curse at me or what he would sometimes say like he was very sad and disappointed in me, but he would not like, he would not like send ugly memes about me or something like that. Like that's just not his style.
Now, did you get to talk with Joe Arpaio at all?
I did not talk with Joe Arpaio. Now, Joe Arpaio is really old.
Right.
He does
I
not do
was
a whole
thinking
lot of
that too.
talking anymore. He is, I mean, I think he is similar, although in some ways he is cemented in the way that I think people who are older have cemented. I think since the death of his wife, quite frankly, he has not quite like been the same mentally. Although he still appears as a kind of like mythic. I feel like his is like he is like a mythic figurehead, and his like actual person is. But Joe Arpaio is again a very important person when you think about things like the role of TV, the role of media, this sort of flagrant disregard for law. Like that was what I became fascinated with, was reading, going back and revisiting how Joe Arpaio basically flagrantly violated the law the whole time and everybody knew it and nobody seemed to quite know what to do for a long time until the DOJ, right? Until eventually like community leaders really pressured the Department of Justice to prosecute him. But like, for a good 20 years before that, he was doing it in the open on TV, right? He had people in tents on, and he would say, "Look, here's the people in tents," and people were like, "Interesting, interesting thing you're doing."
Well, I could talk to you all day about this. I felt like we only scratched the surface of your book. I will say this, like this was one of the best books I've read in the last year. So and I mean that as high praise, and I would strongly recommend it to people to read just because it connects these threads that I don't think were connected well enough. Like I feel like I know a lot about what's happening in the world, and I learned a lot from reading your book.
That's really kind. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, so do you have the book to hold up?
I don't. I should have had one. I'm in my hidey hole, so I don't have the cover.
Yeah.
I should hold
Well,
the book.
if you ever get around to it, send me a autographed hard copy of it.
Yes, I absolutely will, of course. I will get your address and send you one.
Great. Well, we've been talking with Jessica Pishko. Her book, as I've attested to, is excellent. The Highest Law in the Land. It really connects a lot of these threads of this right-wing sheriff's movement with Trumpism, and we didn't get into immigration, ironically enough, given what's going on in the world. But there's just too much happening. I don't know, like I feel like this year, basically since January 20th, has been like nonstop whirlwind. Like there's stuff you just don't believe. And you know, I'm picking and choosing what I can cover because you just can't cover everything.
I think it's absolutely true. So, very unfortunately, but yes, there's actually quite. I was gonna say the plug. There's quite a lot about jails too in there, and
Yeah.
immigration. Like I do talk quite a bit about other aspects we didn't quite get to.
All right. Well, we've been talking with Jessica Pishko. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.